Hello and welcome to a GCSE History Exam Technique presentation on 8-mark consequence questions from paper 2. Our topic today is going to be the fall of the Berlin Wall. So here's our question. Explain two consequences of the fall of the Berlin Wall for 8 marks. This question comes from the 2018 paper and we can expect future question ones to be organised in this way. So starting with the phrase explain two consequences of. You can probably just make out on the screen that the answer booklet will lay out for you two sections for you to write about the two consequences that you identify. Now we're not going to get any stimulus material, so this is going to be a test of our own knowledge and understanding. Just be aware that this question type will only appear on paper 2, so this isn't transferable to any of the other papers. And what we're after is presenting two consequences, and we're going to need to give some specific information about each of them. In this presentation we'll talk about how we'll structure that task. So before we tackle our question, let's just revise the Berlin Wall and its place in the Cold War. It had been constructed in 1961 after a previous Soviet ultimatum to the Allies to leave Berlin had failed to shift them. What the Russians were doing was attempting to stop the flow of people out of communist East Germany and East Berlin, and also attempting to plug a gap in the Iron Curtain. They believed that the free movement into East Germany in the other direction also posed a security risk. As the years passed after the wall had been built, it really became a symbol for Cold War division and communist repression. As much as a physical barrier, its importance became symbolic too. And the wall was a site for some benchmark Cold War speeches. Kennedy made one in 1963, his famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech. And then towards the end of the Cold War, Reagan also made a speech at the Berlin Wall with his famous invitation and order to Gorbachev to tear down the wall. So let's have a look at the fall of the wall in particular. That's the topic for our question. So the wall finally came down, or was breached in November in 1989. In historic scenes, tens of thousands of people simply forced the barriers open, crossed through the border or climbed on top of the wall. There were scenes of joyous celebration. Now this followed indications from the East German government that travel restrictions were going to be lifted, but it was a very confusing period. Nobody's quite clear whether or not, even this goes all the way to the top of government, whether or not travel restrictions were going to be lifted and what was going on. So people just simply forced their way across the wall. In the weeks, months that followed, the significance of this became clear. We're going to look at four results of the wall coming down. Firstly, travel out of the Eastern Bloc was easier. It's probably relevant to note here that it was already possible to leave communist Europe. Czechoslovakia had previously opened its borders, so there was a route out, but it certainly made travelling out of the Eastern Bloc easier, particularly in Germany. The fall of the wall was so symbolic and again so historic with the scenes that it really accelerated the USSR's loss of control of Eastern Europe, and again the significance of the wall is quite symbolic as much as it was a physical barrier here. And in the months that followed, East Germany rejected communism in elections, and that really paved the way to the eventual reunification of Germany later in 1990. So let's return to our question. Here are some features of a good answer. We're going to need to explain and analyse any two consequences, and remember our answer booklet is going to lead us towards doing that. We're going to use our usual P structure. We're going to use a big point sentence first of all, and then we're going to develop that with 2 or 3 sentences of evidence and explain. We don't need to link our consequences together. We don't need to write introductions or conclusions. And our explanations are quite broad. We don't need to identify the impact on a specific feature or factor, so they can be quite broad. We'll explore those features in a model answer. Before we get there, let's just have a look at what our examiner wants from us, and here's a nice quote of some feedback that we've had from the exam board. Question 1 requires specific information added to 2 different explanations offered on consequences for the focus set. So that really just confirms to us that we're identifying consequences, and then we're providing 2 to 3 sentences of evidence and explanation for each of them. So let's just very quickly think about what our answer is going to contain. Earlier we covered some of the consequences of the fall of the Berlin Wall. We came up with 4. We're not going to use all of those, remember. We're going to limit ourselves to just 2, and we'll just take the top 2. So we'll have a look at travelling out of the Eastern Bloc being easier, and first off we're going to look at the acceleration of the loss of control of Eastern Europe. So here's an example from the exam board, and it's worth noting that this was a top level answer. I don't think it was a full marks answer, but this was identified as coming into the top level of the mark scheme. And our answer is going to start off with a big point, and then developed with 2 further sentences of detail about that consequence. You might want to pause for a moment while you read through this paragraph. You might also just want to note as you're reading through, it's really quite general, but our examiners seem to be okay with that and still place that into the top level of the mark scheme. So let's come up with the second half of the answer, and we'll do this for ourselves rather than using materials from the exam board. Here's our big point, a straightforward sentence describing a consequence, and then 3 sentences on an evidence and explain phase where I'm providing further information about that consequence. I've tried to be quite specific, and I'll be hoping to pick up full marks for this. What the answer doesn't contain, of course, and this is absolutely fine, is it doesn't attempt to link the 2 consequences together. There's no introduction and no conclusion in the answer, and our explanations can be quite general. Again, you might just want to pause for a moment here while you read through this second half of the answer. Okay, so question 1 on paper 2 really is that simple. Now you might want to take this further. This might be a good point in your revision to look at the events at the end of the Cold War, maybe looking at the rejection of communism in Eastern Europe, the end of the Warsaw Pact, and then the final collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Or you might just want to try to use the techniques that we've covered in this presentation on a consequence question from the start of the course, and maybe try this model question. Explain 2 consequences of the Truman Doctrine. Okay, thanks for watching. There's more examination guidance on the CHSG History channel.